You can say
Best
it.
hour. I was going to say it, Fern. I was going to say it. You were in the good surprise. We are live.
For the first time in, we'll call it 600. We'll just call it an even 600. That is now an accurate statement.
Hey, you know what? There's been many things in my life that have taken longer than 600 times to master. Some are still ongoing, if you ask my wife.
I was going to say yes. Yeah.
Well, everybody, welcome to Best Hour of Their Day. We are live, and we are breaking down the Level 1 manual. Super excited to do this because it's one of the best books out there when it comes to becoming a better coach, a better trainer. And I think a lot of people either A, never read it, or B, check it out when they're getting ready for their first seminar. And sorry, the comments are already loading. And don't bring that one on the screen, whatever you do. Oh, geez, Cody. I specifically asked you not to do that. These headphones are distracting.
Yep.
This morning, Christian said my hair looks like troll hair. I don't know if that's accurate.
No, troll hair is cool.
But most people that maybe they read this take their Level 1 and then never look back on it. And what's been really fun for me is knowing we were doing this, I've been rereading it, and there's like just gold. It's gold, Jerry. Fern, what was the first time you read the Level 1 manual?
Oh dear God, it had to have been something in around the 2007 time frame.
Yeah, and by the way, Nikki Sharp, these are legit. Nikki Sharp is a self-proclaimed guru gadget. However, on our affiliate university professional development call yesterday, I believe she was using an iPhone 5 when she was recording herself. It had a home
button on it, huh? Got it. Okay.
it had, yeah. It was either
like my mom.
or an Android.
Like my mom.
So you read it in 2007, and one of the things I think we're going to talk about over these episodes is where CrossFit was back when a lot of this was written and where we are today, 15, 16 years later. And we hope that all of you, there's 30 plus people watching live currently. We hope that you have read this because we want to hear from you as we go through this. If you're not sure where to find it, simply type into your Google machine L1 CrossFit manual, and voila, it will present itself. So pretty cool that, let's just talk about this. It's out there for free. Anyone can check it out, whether or not you've signed up for the L1 certificate course.
Yeah, I think, Cody, can you drop that link? Can you put that link in the chat or in the show notes?
How fancy are we? Can Cody do this? For the record, this is our first time using a new platform. We are live. There we go.
See it.
There
Boom.
you go.
Can you put that on
that, everybody?
Can you pull that comment up there, Cody?
He could do it.
Cody. You do anything? Boom, right there.
Okay. No, yeah, I don't think you can click on that, but I'm sure on YouTube you've dropped the link.
It'll give you a pretty good idea in Level 1 Trainer Guide. So here's what I am. I'm genuinely excited about this because I was on one of the calls that Jay actually never attends, which is the HQ staff development calls, which is why
this morning were you on that one today?
Which is why you continue to be a subpar trainer.
I'm no flow master, Fern.
Yeah, you are not. I want to change my screen name to Flowmaster Fern.
Okay, while you're doing that, but do you have a shirt with your face on an elf?
Yeah.
Do you have this shirt?
Yeah, I have my face chiseled into the side of a mountain. All the crew from
we got a Tijuana.
Forces Training.
Tijuana.
Oh, nice. So what's cool about this is we were talking about this, and we did some breakout sessions in there talking about weaknesses and where you struggle. And one of the places where I kind of admitted I struggle is I've been doing this a long time, as have you. And sometimes I will not prepare to the extent that I need to prepare. So there's a difference between I can show up to a class cold and not write a lesson plan and still run a good class, or show up to a seminar and not do a ton of prep for the lecture and still give a good lecture. That doesn't mean that's what we should do. And one of the things I said I've committed to is kind of like revisiting the Level 1 manual. And we're just going to do that with everybody, right? So we just get to go back to the basics and literally read the Level 1 manual, because I think the number of people that haven't done this is probably a wild number. you know, and you should. Like, there's some pretty profound information in here, and also there's some clarifying information in here on like what CrossFit is and what it is not. And we're going to dive into that, and we're going to deep dive in here and maybe highlight some things that people are not aware of if you're reading the manual and you're going to your level 1 or you're prepping for your level 3. This is something you should be doing.
Or level 4, which is coming back out next year.
Yeah. I mean, at this point, the level 4, you should know this information. That's a little bit different. That's a little bit more practical. I don't know that how much revisiting this is going to help you go out into the floor and like crush it in a class, but you should.
Well, one thing you said, something you said that I think the listeners need to hear again. I mean, whether myself or Fern, you know, we've been doing this 15 plus years, and yeah, Fern can show up to any given class any day at CrossFit Rife and provide an excellent experience, just like he can show up at any seminar and give the what is CrossFit or what is fitness lecture or coach a breakout group. But you can't rest on your laurels. If you want to be a level 4, or you want to make it on seminar staff, or you simply want to be the best coach you can be, you gotta revisit the basics. You gotta go back and do things like read the manual again, prepare, study, etc. It doesn't just, it's a perishable skill, coaching.
Let's see how many questions. Pull that question over here real quick. They from Christian. They're yeah. How many questions do coaches ask that could have been found in level 1? All of them. All of the questions can be found in the level 1 manual. That is
pretty much
short and sweet of that. That's not inaccurate. You know, I'm saying that tongue in cheek, but it's not entirely inaccurate.
Yeah, and what I like about it is, you know, there is still quite a bit of gray when you're going through the level 1. Like, some of it obviously faults and points of performance, etc. But when we're looking at the methodology and the theory lectures, you can really interpret it differently. And I think that's some of the things we might find on today's episode. You know, we've got a point that I think is gray, and it's one of the points that some people use as a criticism of CrossFit. It's one of the things that we might use as a positive when we get there. So, you know, we're going to break this down chapter by chapter. For those of you watching, make sure you're following the Best Hour of Their Day Instagram, because we will always put up there in advance where we are in there, as well as potentially some homework and some other things for you to cover before watching, because we want to hear from you throughout this. Yeah, Candy, excited for the maybe we all aspire to be on. Look, Candy, I need you to relax. Even if you earn your level 4, it doesn't mean you're on my level. It does not mean that you're on my level. And you're what's your answer to that, Fern?
How many hours should someone coach before taking the level 1? I mean, if you're like the vast majority of us, the answer is none, and then you just go take your level 1. I mean, I don't know that it necessarily matters, right? It's just like, hey, when do I start my journey? The answer is yesterday. So, you know, I think a lot of people, it's just a weird question. It's just how you start. The answer was yesterday, but how you start? Do you start underneath somebody? Do you not have the opportunity to start underneath somebody? Just start. Just go start coaching classes, and that's how you get good at this stuff.
Yeah, when's the best time to take your level 1? Yesterday. When's the next best time? This weekend. Go get it. So hey, honorary, whatever. Call it whatever you want, Christian. So you want to dive into this? You want to get going?
Yeah, let's go.
Let's so for those of you, oh, really, we got some spam comments. Well, we got a new fan.
Oh, sweet. Jay's in need of a hot girl, so thanks, Sex69-Fun. Yeah,
they know where to find me. So for those of you following along, we're just going to break down the first couple pages, understanding CrossFit, because that's what it's all about. Let's dig into this. So, Fern, you read the first few pages?
Yeah, so can you pull that up real quick, Cody? And we just start. It's basically, I mean, it's.
By the way, before we even go any further, is that DT up there?
But it could be, but I have thoughts about it. I don't know.
No.
It could be a lot of people. I've for many years thought it is DT, but I've also don't think it is DT.
Who do you think it is? If you don't think it's DT, Cabo? Does it look like Cabo a little bit?
It could be Cabo. It could be, dude. It could be a lot of people. It's just literally.
When I do this,
It looks like the back of a woman's head.
How big is my nose when I come in this close? Is it really?
It verifies that you are in fact Jason.
Are you censoring yourself because we're live today? I think you just censored yourself.
I don't know that live matters. Yeah, we're saying words is saying words. But yeah, so we're basically starting on page 2 of that manual, and it starts with understanding CrossFit. And again, like I think, so go down a little bit more, Cody. Yeah, so past the table of contents should be the first page. So not 2 on there. That's the 2 number of pages, but work off the actual, yeah, right there. So understanding CrossFit. It says the aims, prescription, methodology, implementation, and adaptations of CrossFit are collectively and individually unique, defining of CrossFit, and instrumental in our program's successes in, you highlighted, in diverse applications. Right. And it says, and then it goes into aims. I think everybody should read this. From the beginning, the aim of CrossFit has been to forge a broad, general, and inclusive fitness. We sought to build a program that would best prepare trainees for any physical contingency, prepare them not only for the unknown, but for the unknowable. Looking at all sport and physical tasks collectively, we asked what physical skills and adaptations would most universally lend themselves to performance advantage. Capacity culled, sorry, my eyes are getting weird, culled from the intersection of all sports demands would quite logically lend itself well to all sport. In sum, our specialty is not specializing, right? And which I think is important, because the number one criticism of CrossFit is clearly outlined in the goal of CrossFit, which is like, hey, you guys aren't good at certain things. And I'm like, it's quite literally in the design and in the desired outcome of CrossFit is not to specialize in anything. So it's done intentionally. It's not, this is not a misapplication of variance, right? It was quite literally the intent.
Well, and I think it was, who's that author who did Starship Troopers? I want to say it's Heinlein. But he, something like, he says specialization is for insects, and you can find that, Cody. But I agree with you, Fern. But here's what I would say about that. What's interesting is back in 2007, when this was written, it was very true. If you did CrossFit, you weren't going to be good at anything, like meaning on the extremes, right? But today, the best CrossFitters are better than a lot of people in their specific sport.
Well, it's funny. I was talking to Pat Barber on that call that you failed to show up to for personal development, and he was talking about, I don't know how it came up. We were just talking about, he's like, hey, remember when back in the day we were doing CrossFit? And for those of you who've been around for a while, like, it was very common for people like, hey, you're never gonna. Oh, we were talking about Kevin Ogar because he just benched 200 kilos, I believe.
So it's like 450 pounds.
It's like 440. Yeah, it's like 440. He said that his legs were stronger than my arms. And I was like, you're probably not wrong.
That is funny coming from Kevin.
No, but because like Kevin's really, really strong upper body, and obviously he's very focused training torso up. But Pat Barber was saying, he's like, remember when everybody was like, hey, you're never gonna get strong being CrossFit, and then everybody got stronger. It's just like all CrossFitters are on steroids, and they're like, or the shit works. And it's like, are there people on steroids? Undoubtedly. Right, who they are, I don't care. That's not my job, and not what I'm worried about. But the point is like, you start chasing not being a specialist, and not only do you get gains in certain places, you get significant gains in places and significant capacity in areas that otherwise were considered to not be achievable, and to be well-rounded.
I mean, to the point that there are CrossFitters making Olympic teams.
Yeah, I think so. Like Ogar was on the Paralympic powerlifting
team,
right?
Tia, obviously, also
a couple of the ladies outside of the in South America as well. But yeah, specialization is for insects. Got it.
I think when Glassman, one of the things he said is like, one day we're going to see a 400-pound back squat with the same person that can run a 5-minute mile. And I would argue just about every games athlete, not just about, I would assume all games athletes can do that this day, but well beyond the form. I mean, at the Rogue Invitational last week, there was 4 or 5. They had to do 15 reps of it within a workout.
Adam Klink, who is still part of the Ben Smith blueprint, but was a head coach at CrossFit Krypton. You guys can check out that episode and are dropping in when we went there recently. But Adam Klink back squatted 500 and ran a 5-minute mile in the same day.
Yeah, Austin Malleolo deadlifted 600 and ran a marathon in the same day.
Yeah, that's and all of that to just show that, like, hey, you can have extremely high capacity in a broad range of modalities, which, again, going back to the aim of the program, was the goal, right? When we're talking about unknown and unknowable, and to use these terms exactly where they're looking at, lend themselves to performance advantage, right? Capacity called from the intersection of all sports demands would quite logically lend itself well to all sport, right? And I think that's the beauty of that whole thing is what's interesting about this whole thing is, like, as you go back and read this, you realize that, like, he backed his way into the program. Instead of trying to create a program that went somewhere, he was like, what would I want to be able to do? And then it was just like, oh, well, here's what I want to be. I would want to be able to do all those things. And then what would that look like? And then which leads into the prescription, which is kind of the next part, which is the definition of CrossFit. And so if a lot of this stuff sounds familiar, the verbiage, because like this, we're roundabout ways working through some of the lecture material. So when we're talking about CrossFit, this is the parts and pieces of this are pulled out of this manual to create the level 1 lecture series. The first one being, what is CrossFit?
What do you think came first? Obviously, this is dated 2007, but I'm sure much of this was written. And then along the way, around 2005, 6, they started going out there and putting out seminars. Do you think Glassman was just kind of giving these lectures and was like, write that down? Or do you think he was writing a lot of this first and then pulled it into the lectures itself?
Well, he's writing it first because remember he wrote the What is Fitness lecture in 2002.
Yeah, early on. Yeah.
Or it might have been 2004, but it was like early before there was like a seminar series, before there was any lectures. And even for the first several years, there was no definitive outline for the seminars. Like, he would just go talk, and then over time, the other people that showed up every weekend, that ended up being like the Dave Castros, the Pat Sherwoods, the Nicole Carrolls, the Annie Sakamotos, like that group were able to extract that information and then put it into, a more I don't want to say coherent, but a more concisely designed document, which then led to the development of the actual lectures in their capacity that you see today when you sit for the level 1 or the level 2.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk about this a little later on. But when I took my level 1, he gave all of the lectures. He was up there from what is CrossFit, through programming, and people chimed in here and there. And I think it was like they clearly had a plan for the weekend, but it wasn't what it is today, where 15, 20 seminars around the world are doing the same exact thing in the same exact moment. Of course, with you being Flowmaster, the timeline in Virginia will be a little thrown off, but most of the other seminars will be running efficiently. Ours
will be tight, baby.
Yeah, right.
Mine only run a little late if I'm working with Chuck.
Yeah, well, yeah. Chuck can pull it off because people are just happy to be around Chuck. So let's dig in. Constantly varied functional movements at high intensity. Do you remember the first time you heard? Yeah, do you remember hearing that for the first time?
I wish I did remember the first time I hear it. I don't remember that specifically. I do remember vaguely the What is Fitness lecture. But I really do. It was so long ago at this point. This is 2000 and I think it's either late 2007 or early 2008. And I believe it was either Pat Sherwood or Andrew. Oh God, what was his last name? He was a Marine, blonde hair guy, super smart dude. Chuck talks about him a lot, but anyway, it was one of them, I believe, that gave that lecture, the What is Fitness lecture. But it is interesting that what's interesting about that definition, it is while precise, it is also very broad. Meaning, when you think about what is CrossFit? You say constantly varied function movements executed at high intensity. You're like, damn, those are pretty wide left and right lateral limits that allow for an immense amount of creativity, which is what we see in the CrossFit landscape, which has then given us the level of athletes that we now see today.
Yeah, and no, it was not Stump, Brandon, that Fern's referring to.
No, not Stump. It was he's a Navy SEAL.
No, and again, going back to all of this, there's so much, like you said, there's wide margins on all of this, like constantly varied the functional movements and even high intensity. And I think that's one of the reasons I love CrossFit so much is I love the gray areas of CrossFit.
Yeah, and so a lot of people struggle with that definition. So admittedly, even like when we kind of redesigned our onboarding process and we were like trying to do that, like we would give that, we would use the phrase, because that is in fact the technical definition of CrossFit. But very quickly, and I think Keith Wittenstein, I've heard him say this very eloquently. Like he's always just like, let's unpack that, because there's a lot there in those 6 words, or is high intensity one word with a hyphen in there? I don't know, but like 5 maybe. But the point is, let's call it 6, right? 5.5, right? There's a lot there, which is then unpacked in the lecture. And I think what's cool about that is like, you can dive into each one of those, but like if we were just to do this very succinctly, if I was to kind of put that in what we would describe maybe more layman's terms, it's just like constantly varied. Hey, we're going to change things very frequently. High intensity, let's call it above 70%. And then functional movements, things that you're already doing. So let's do things that you're already doing at 70% or higher, and let's change them frequently, right? I'm not trying to redefine CrossFit, but for like the lay person, like Grandma Jenny who comes into the gym, that might stick a little bit more if you were kind of pressed for time and don't have a 40 minutes to give the What is CrossFit lecture. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people do that naturally when their buddy's like, hey, tell me what this CrossFit thing is. Or someone new walks into the box and you're kind of like, well, we work out pretty hard. We change it up every day. And there are movements you do outside of here. And like, oh, okay, that sounds cool. I can do that. Right? Versus, I think most of us wrap up the What is CrossFit lecture by saying something like, so next time someone asks you what CrossFit is, you pull out your whiteboard.
Right.
You ask them if they got an hour, right? But it's like, at the end, and my favorite way, it's always what Glassman used to say, hey, you want to know what CrossFit is? Can you show up tomorrow at 9 a.m.? I'll show you exactly what it is, right? Like That's the old school way of doing it. Obviously, that's not what most affiliates do these days, but yeah, we can break it down to these 3 things. And for those of you that have taken the level 1, we certainly break down functional movement into the, descriptive characteristics as well as the defining characteristic, which we will get to, in these episodes. And then, high intensity. And so you said something, let's unpack that a little bit. 70%.
This is, admittedly, I stole this from Pat Sherwood because I heard him say this years ago, but when we talk about high intensity, like would be the most kind of succinct way to talk about that? Because high intensity gets a lot of hate because it's misconstrued. And we've talked about this before in the podcast, misconstrued or misinterpreted or whatever you want to call it for maximal effort.
Yeah.
And while high intensity technically by its very nature does include maximal effort, we're not suggesting that it's maximal effort all the time. So if we say there's a high, again, reasonable to assume there's a medium and there's a low, mathematically speaking, that would make high 66.6% or higher, right? Which doesn't sound all that crazy. I'm like, hey, 70% today. I'm like, still high intensity. If we're just talking about like somebody's perceived effort or RPE, if you want to use that kind of metric, like use that as like but it does factor in some other things. And I think that's important. But like, if we're going to go by this statement, it says CrossFit is constantly varied functional movements executed at high intensity. This is our prescription. Functional movements are universal motor recruitment patterns. They're performed in a wave of contraction from core to extremity. They're compound movements, i.e. they're multi-joint. They're natural, effective, and efficient locomotors for body and external objects, right? That is kind of like very quickly outlining essentially the descriptors, right? Like there's a difference. There's 2 different ways you can talk about, or 2 different ways you can look at functional movements. Like what is the defining characteristic? What legitimately makes it different from its non-functional counterparts? And then like, how would I describe it? Right. So one is like math. The other one is just like, what does it look like? Right. So when you're talking about universal motor recruitment patterns, we're just talking about like, there's a series of patterns in human movement, natural human movement, that would lend themselves to everything else, right? Meaning like they're going to be found pretty much anywhere that you go, the battlefield, right? The job site, the playing field. And by running or sprinting, you would inherently start to get better at deadlifting, and vice versa, or squatting or punching or throwing. So when we're talking about universal motor recruitment patterns, like that's what we're talking about. Universal meaning like, think of it as ubiquitous. They're everywhere.
And they look the same too. One of the
Right, they're
examples
very similar.
You get somebody kipping on a pull-up bar, throw them on the ground, they're doing the hollow, they're doing an arch, flip them upside down, they're doing handstand push-ups, put a barbell overhead, they're doing a push press, right? All these
Butterfly
movements,
swimming, throwing a soccer ball, spiking a volleyball, like all those things.
Yeah, and one of my memories from my level one was, and I think he said this in some of the videos out there, he used to say, when he would talk about they're essential to quality of life, and we need to be doing these movements. And then, he would get to safe and say they're safe. He'd be like, it'd be pretty ludicrous to get up here and say these movements are essential, you should be doing them, but they're really freaking dangerous, right? They're safe. They're safe relative to other non-functional movements. Like here I am at a Lifetime gym, and you go downstairs, people are doing movements where it's like, if I loaded that up real heavy, you're going to tear a pec. You're going to, blow your ACL. Where, functional movements, everyone listening to this episode right now has failed a lift, and they're fine. Cool.
Right.
Like The Hangover, but did you die? And the answer is no. You're here to talk about it.
Yeah. So just to outline those, the 6 descriptors are natural, universal motor recruitment patterns, essential, safe, compound yet irreducible, and quarter extremity. So those are the 6 descriptors that we would use for that. Essential just meaning like they're essential for quality of your
you want to be able to
quality
do
of life.
Forever.
Your independent living and quality of life, right? Like I would like to say, like when we're talking about essential, meaning like these are the use or lose type deals. Like if you stop squatting, you'll have the inability to squat anymore, but if you start squatting again, you can get it back. Right? And you're going to need to do those things to like navigate your daily life.
We were on our professional development call yesterday. I think it was Nick actually who's in the comments there, coaching 2 people on the squat, and squatting to a box, cool. But a lot of PTs are like, hey, you can't squat. And I'm like, cool. If they stop squatting, they never start again.
Right. Pull that comment up from Christian there, Cody, about the CAP programming. So this is a common misconception, is that you cannot have people get stronger over time. We'll get to this in programming, but I did want to bring that up there. When variance is applied appropriately, linear, some sort of linear program or linearization, linear periodization isn't necessarily required. It doesn't mean it's not useful or good. It's just not required, until I get to a certain point, and then it probably is required. But we will talk about more once we get to the programming aspect of the trainer manual. The compound yet irreducible portion of those descriptors is like, that's just what I describe as like natural human movement, or somebody who does something the right way, right? If you were a caveman or just an animal, like not even a human being, like everything that you would do in order to interact with the world, to do it and like continue to live, would be done in that fat. Like you would either throw something, you would run, you would jump, you would sprint, you would swim. It would be done with that pattern intact. And I think the example you give is like, hey, throw an object with your non-dominant hand. That whole thing gets violated, and then it breaks down. The outcome that you're rooting for, either high velocity or long distance, probably both, is non-existent anymore. And that's what we're talking about, just like natural human movement, and all these kind of have a little bleed over, right? So universal motor recruitment patterns is a ton of bleed over into quarter extremity patterns. And then also listed in there is compound yet irreducible. And that's just simply saying there is the biggest bang for your buck is training movements the way that they're already done in life and not isolating them. not to be confused with isolation movements have no value. That's not the statement, right? The statement is they have the biggest return on investment if you train your body the way it is actually working in human life, meaning the hamstring curl, while it is good for making the hamstring stronger, is not actually how the hamstring works biomechanically on the human body. Not to say that you shouldn't do the hamstring curl, but if all you do is hamstring curls and then you run out onto the field and you want to do some sprints and be a human being, you're probably going to blow a hamstring because you've never trained it. You've trained it.
And you do these movements.
Right. Yeah. Doing a pistol. So
no, and you know, something we say at the level 1 is right. Like, and I think this, you go down and you see somebody doing the leg extension, the leg curl, the yes, no machine, the calf raise, etc. They may not be able to squat 225, even 135. Where if I get a CrossFitter, you know, and not an extremely strong CrossFitter, even who can squat 225, like they're going to be fine on any of the leg machines you would have typically done on a leg day.
Well, the other thing that's left out of that, and for whatever reason, or just not highlighted there necessarily with regard to that whole concept of isolation, is like isolation typically does not account for full anatomical or natural end ranges. Meaning, like if I'm going to do, again, nothing wrong with the leg press, but there's a reason people can leg press 1,400 pounds and can only back squat 315.
Did you see me leg pressing earlier? Did you see me? Because that's exactly what I leg pressed.
It looked as bad as I thought it was going to look. Yeah. So again, I think there's a weird argument about like they're poo-pooing on these other movements. I'm like, no, do them. I don't care. Just understand that the return on those movements is not as great as the return on doing compound movements. Or I guess some people would call it like free weight lifting, but doing free weight lifting the way they're supposed to be done, full anatomical end range, you know, barring any sort of significant injury or limitation at appropriate loads, and then progressing in volume, speed, or weight appropriately.
Yeah. And I think just like CrossFit gets its fair share of criticism, CrossFitters and level 1 trainers and, you know, all the way through affiliate owners can get a little too dogmatic about CrossFit. Like back in the day, it was like if someone was I literally had a shirt at my first affiliate that said, "Friends don't let friends do bicep curls." Now we can argue the functionality of a bicep curl because many people would say it's a functional movement. But point being, I think you're doing a really nice job saying like, hey, don't poo-poo on this stuff. Just understand the pitfalls or the downfalls or why we think functional movements are better. And I think as a whole, that's a message a lot of CrossFitters need to hear. You know, it's 2022. We recognize at this point, some of the best CrossFit Games athletes out there do some other movements, and you should be varying your life and throwing in a yoga class or whatever makes you feel good and happy at the end of the day, right? So don't get so dogmatic about it because then we're just as guilty as the rest of the world.
So I guess is like we can move to the next piece, which is like the next sentence says, but no aspect of functional movements is more important than their capacity to move large loads, long distances, and do so quickly. Collectively, these three attributes, load, distance, and speed, or you can think time, uniquely qualify functional movements for the production of high power. Intensity is defined exactly as power, and intensity is the independent variable most commonly associated with maximizing the rate of return on favorable adaptation. Right. So that's the key part when we're talking about like, okay, here's how you would describe functional movements. When we talk about like what makes them different, it's their ability for high power output, right? Large loads, long distance quickly. Key component to that is like relative to their non-functional counterparts, right? So an example we would give, again, typically like you use like, let's say you weigh 185 pounds and I just do an air squat. And I was like, you got 60 seconds to do air squat and we count those reps. And then I do okay, we measure the range of motion, call it 2 feet. We have you do a hamstring curl, roughly 2 feet from extension to full curl to your butt. Distance traveled, 185 pounds loaded. You're not going to have the same output. Not because your hamstrings are weak, but because relatively speaking, there's more musculature involved in moving your total body weight other than just your hamstring, right? So that's an isolation movement, can be very useful. but not the same as a what we would describe as a functional or natural movement. Those have the ability to do high power output, mathematically speaking, right? And this is the part where we move away from the subjective world, or like, hey, what's better, or what produces high power or intensity, and the objective nature of that statement. When we talk about intensity, we're not talking about the correlate or the subjective use of intensity. We're talking about the mathematical problem: force times distance over time equals average power, which is exactly equal to intensity. When we use the term intensity, this is always a point that I think should be delineated when we start to have this debate or discussion, is like, we need to make sure that we're using terms correctly and that we've defined them. Because if somebody's using the term intensity in the sense of RPE, and we're using intensity in the form of mathematics, not to say either one of those is right or wrong, it would depend on the context of the conversation, but we would just be simply talking past each other. Like, will you say that an orange is an apple, and I say that an orange is a pear? And it's just like, can we just call an orange and agree on terms? And I think that's always something that just gets kind of like rushed past for some reason in those discussions. Understanding, when we talk about intensity, when we talk about high intensity, we're talking about that ability to move large loads long distances and do so quickly, right? This is why the short kind of hallmark workouts in CrossFit hurt so much. The Frans, the Dianes, is because, like, large loads, long distances quickly. If you think about the load moved in a Fran, 95 pounds for 45 rep thruster and pull-ups, and how fast you're doing those 90 reps. Yeah, not shocking that there's a high lactate environment introduced to the human body, at which point it feels like your insides are boiling.
Yeah, we can break down all the girls as we go through this. I want you to answer the question down there. And the reason I want you to answer that, Fern, is because I've got to take a quick bathroom break. Welcome to Fern's life, everybody.
Right. Would this comparison also apply to lifting, contrary to throwing, considering that we humans are anatomically made for throwing, which it is in the theoretical hierarchy for the development of an athlete, by the way? Everybody forgets that. How much throwing should be programmed then in comparison to lifting? I would answer that, and this is just my opinion. I don't know that there's a right answer to that, but I do appreciate the question. This would be something where I would kind of refer back to World-Class Fitness in 100 Words, when he talks about, regularly learn and play new sports. So with regard to that, should a human being be able to throw? Yeah, absolutely think they should be able to throw. To what degree should they be able to throw? I think that depends on what is this person trying to accomplish. We would probably agree that inability to throw would manifest itself in other deficiencies. Competent ability to throw would also manifest itself positively in a lot of places. But to what degree would I need to train that would depend on what this person's goals were. Are they a sports-specific athlete? Obviously, a baseball player, a softball pitcher, a football quarterback, a lacrosse player, a lot of throwing. We should probably spend more time throwing. But if you're not, I would just be like, I would want the baseline level of athletic capacity to throw using quarter extremity principles appropriately to have that power output. And then I would move on, because spending any more time there, there would be little to no return on that, if that makes sense. So I hope that kind of answers the question. So,
well, this was really spotlighted. What year was that? 2009, when they did the softball throw?
I
want to say 9.
It was a long time. It wasn't 2009. No, because it was in Aromas, and 2009 was 2009 was in Aromas, and that was done in Carson.
Cool. So maybe it was 10. It was early on, but
correct.
We saw plenty of games athletes that couldn't throw very well, and they were still plenty fit. But yeah, I like what you said there. It's probably a strong correlate, right? You should be able to do it. So thinking back on this,
I would tell you this, like having playing a lot of sport. This is actually a great discussion. I obviously spent a lot of time around a whole plethora of athletes growing up. I played a lot of sports growing up. But no, here's my point, which is like the athletes that had solid capacity to throw, which regardless of which sport they specialized in, were generally speaking the most athletic. Right. So like whether they were a baseball player or not by trade, the ones that were really athletic could throw a baseball. Right. But counter argument was not the same, meaning like I love wrestlers, you're wrestlers, but wrestlers are notorious for like not being real great out of anything outside of wrestling. Like you put them,
I
give them
will throw a football over that fence over there.
Which happens to be 4 feet from you. But the and again, not a shot at wrestlers, but like I have a lot of wrestler friends that like to pick on them. But they but that would be an example where like high capacity, but that act of throwing was not there, and they would have a really tough time translating their skill set of wrestling to another sport. Where typically what I saw was like somebody who could throw, and it's a really interesting question. Somebody who can throw is typically really good across multiple sports.
That's very interesting. And I would argue
I would pay a lot.
Like a little Nerf one, maybe. I can throw a baseball well. I can throw a ball well. And I could. I'm gonna say something outlandish, which I rarely do. I can throw both sides. Both sides. Lefty. This is lefty. Right. That's why I played a lot of handball. And you have to play both ways.
Not the handball that you guys are thinking of, but the handball.
And I do want to say we've got some new listeners, new fans. Do you want to tell them all about your Division I career? Do you want to get into that on the first episode?
I don't. Live? That's your job. Your job is to talk about my accolades. Yeah.
Yep. Division I.
But no, that was I think, and if anybody, I mean, I'm sure you knew people that were like that, but like that tends to be true. Of like if they're good throwers, they're usually pretty athletic.
Yeah, and I think you're pretty spot on about wrestlers too. And I think partly because we get into wrestling because we are in fact
not
athletic, which is like you said, it's like because you could get so good at wrestling. Like I'm not athletic just by being stubborn, right? And like fitness, right? Like if you can go hard for that 5 to 6 minutes, like you can bypass so much athletic. Now, if you happen to be athletic as well, that's when you elevate.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And this is not to say that wrestlers are not athletic. The peak end of almost any sport, you're talking about every person there is athletic in nature. So anyway, so here's I think the next part, which is like recognizing that breadth and depth of a program's stimulus will determine the breadth and depth of the adaptation it elicits. Our prescription of functionality intensity is constantly varied. We believe that preparation for random physical challenges, i.e. the unknown and unknowable events, is at odds with fixed, predictable, and routine regimens. And there's another statement in the lecture where he says like any routine, no matter how complete, contains within its omissions the parameters for which there will be no adaptation. Right? That's a Greg Glassmanism.
What I'm loving about this as we go through it together again also is like seeing how much of this is a part of the level one. And some of the things that we still say, on a weekly basis. Give that last line again, because I want to make an analogy.
The one that I read, or the
one you just said at the end.
Oh no, what he says is like any so I can read that one again. So it says
within any program.
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah. So within any any program. Sorry, I'm blanking again. I just had a brain fart.
Got it.
Any program, no matter how complete, contains within its omissions the parameters for which there will be no adaptation.
Right? Yeah, and here's my analogy. And, I'm gonna give it for Christian because he's listening. Star Wars analogy. Anyone watching Star Wars? It's like you have that Death Star from Episode 4, New Hope, and it was like indestructible. However, there's one little spot where if you shoot a laser in there like Luke did, the thing explodes. And that's kind of always what this reminds me of. Like no matter how robust, no matter how awesome your programming, your training, there's a spot in there that we can destroy you.
Well, this is we can talk about this on a practical level. So this is
Star Wars nerds. Let me know how that was.
So it's not bad. I don't know if you're up on Andor, but I doubt that.
I've not watched Andor yet.
So that statement is a direct how would I describe this? It calls out fixed programming of things like strength plus Metcon, right?
Mhm.
And again, not to say that those things are bad, but understand that by doing it that way, you are creating weaknesses inside the programming. Meaning, if that's all I ever do, we know a handful of things about the degree with which you're strength training. Meaning, like the volume, the loading is probably not optimal. We won't say good or bad, just optimal. And then we know that the length of the Metcons, it probably falls within a very finite window, probably something in the 7 to 12, maybe 15 on the long end, which means immediately I know that you are very likely deficient in longer Metcons, 20, 30 minutes. Okay. Which again, if you're not trying to do that, that's fine. That's cool. And CrossFit is not actually poo-pooing that either. They're just saying simply that you need to recognize that there is a deficiency being designed there by the nature of the design of the program.
I like that. Too many people just get upset like strength metcon is dumb. Not necessarily, right? Depends on
It's
what your
great.
goals are, right? But like you just said, here's the issue. If you do strength and metcon 5 days a week, we have a really good idea of what your strength training looks like, as well as what your conditioning looks like, and we know where you're weak. So I think that's the bigger issue, right? It's not strength and metcon are inherently wrong. It's that when done exclusively, and we'll get to this throughout the manual as well, like you'll fail at the margins of your experiences. Because like you said, it's very hard in a 60-minute class to brief somebody, warm them up, throw in a cool down at the end, and then plug in strength and metcon and go longer than 15 minutes. It's damn near impossible, unless you're doing work up to a 1 rep max in 6 minutes, which is not what they're doing.
Yeah. Cody, let's go to the next page, talk methodology. Because just on these first 2 pages, I mean, there is a broad coverage of numerous theory lectures in these first 2 pages, for the record. Right. So once we get into
here's what I'm thinking. If you show up and you've read this, you're going to be, I would guess, Fern, we've reached on probably 200 plus seminars. How many people show up every weekend having actually read this?
A handful. I know a couple people that are like uber nerds. Like, I read the whole thing start to finish. I'm like, all right, well, you probably be just fine. The issue is you have to. There's so much. There's so much here, and that's what I was saying. Like, just the first 2, we haven't got past the first. We haven't got to page 4 yet, right?
Yeah, and we've covered 3 pages on
we've covered like 3 separate lectures here, right? So in this next one, it says the methodology that drives CrossFit is entirely empirical. We believe meaningful statements about safety, efficacy, and efficiency, the 3 most important and interdependent facets to evaluate any fitness program, can be supported only by measurable, observable, and repeatable data, right? So this statement right here, which is on page 2 under methodology of the trainer manual, is expressly stating the opposite of all internet trolls, and CrossFit is all we care about is going fast and lifting heavy weights, right? They're talking about like one of those 3 components is safety.
The first one, by the way.
Yeah. Right.
And I think CrossFit ruined me for most other, not sport is the right word, but training, because I love the measurable, observable, and repeatable aspect of CrossFit.
Right.
And I think that's what we all, to the point that sometimes I'll see a workout that has something like flutter kicks,
right,
or even up downs, right? And it's like, cool, what's measurable, observable, and repeatable about this? Because I can move my legs this far this time, I can jump back this far this time, and now I don't know, what I'm comparing it to. And by the way, this, goes against a lot of people's, beliefs. It's like, well, you're competing with people in your class. I'm like, no, I want to know because I want to do better myself next time. And I don't know what I did this time if it's a movement that's not measurable.
Well, this again, the brilliance of the definition of CrossFit is what makes it so intriguing in my mind, right? When we're talking about variable, when we're talking about constantly varied, you can constantly vary everything, meaning like we shouldn't always measure the things that we train. The point is that we can, and the point is that the ones that have high power output distinctly are different and have different adaptation and stimulus is the ones that do not. Similarly, and I think it was Max from Training Think Tank, who I think is uber smart, posed a question to Dave Castro not too long ago about like, hey, if I didn't time it, is it still CrossFit? It's like, absolutely.
That was when you did that swimming deadlift workout,
and
right?
it's like, absolutely, it still is. And Dave, I think he answered that too there. But like, variance would also entail not timing it or not measuring it, just doing it for quality, right? It's very everything. And we say that in the lectures, like, hey, you should vary every conceivable aspect of your program, which sometimes means not doing it for intensity, and sometimes means not measuring it or timing it.
It also means sometimes listening to Dave Matthews Band when you're working out.
Or Britney Spears, which you like to do.
Yeah, and you tie that back to the intensity piece we talked about earlier, and you said like 70%. Like, hey, maybe one way you kind of ratchet down intensity at times is don't throw that clock on, and and just move, and it's okay. So I hear you on that. I think.
But going back to what
being dogmatic.
Well, but I think the dogmatic aspect in a lot of scenarios is due to lack of understanding. I don't think it's actually dogmatic. I think it's ignorance.
So I'm ignorant.
Well, that was a foregone conclusion, but I'm talking about the listeners, right? And what I mean by that is
our listeners are ignorant. Yes.
Well, listen, hey, if you're ignorant, that just means we can educate you and we can help you. If you don't care, that's a different story, right? But the point of
Bernie,
that is,
you quote Bernie Fernie, aren't you? Go ahead. Yeah. Do you drop your dad's famous quote?
Yeah, either stupid or don't give a shit, and I can only help you with one. Right. So, but the point of that is when we're talking about the measuring aspect of that or the intensity side of it, it's like, well, if I didn't do 100%, is it really CrossFit? And it's just like, it's still high intensity by definition, right? It's just not maximal, right? And to think that you're only going to get some positive adaptation or the intended stimulus that you're looking for at maximal training effort is ignorant, going back to where I started. So understanding like, hey, sometimes, or what we would describe as like a moving day is still going to have tremendous value, probably most of the time, right? And I think understanding that, it's just like, hey, just because you didn't hit max effort and PR doesn't mean that it wasn't high intensity, right? Because that's a very objective statement. High intensity relative to what? Like, what was the power output on that effort? It was probably very high. If we're talking about like absolute horsepower, it wasn't low, right?
Yeah,
and you'll still get adaptation.
Even at 45 pounds, like that's still high, right? That's still a high power up. Like you move that barbell 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet in a second. Like that's pretty freaking high power, And I also think going back to the intensity piece, and we'll get into this in technique later on, there's also relative intensity. And relative intensity is not, if you take the level one, we talk about relative intensity from the perspective of me compared to grandma or Fern or you, the listener, right? Everyone's relative intensity is different across people. However, relative intensity is unique to any given human being on any given day, right? If you come into the box today and you've had a big fight with your significant other or didn't sleep well or feel great, like I know I'm going to ratchet up or down your intensity depending on those factors.
And then this is probably where the last piece, where we talk about implementation, right? Not the last piece, but the next piece is in implementation. CrossFit is quite simply a sport, the sport of fitness, which is one of the things that separated CrossFit.
But this was something I kind of foreshadowed earlier. A lot of people will critique CrossFit because of that statement, right? It is a sport. Like not everyone should be doing this because it is a sport. But
not everybody should be doing it as a sport, but it is a sport.
It could be, and also that sport
could be a casual sport.
And it also could be a sport in which you're simply trying to improve yourself, not necessarily. I don't care what Cody did. I don't care what you did. I don't care what this person did. I want to know, is my Fran time better than it was 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago? And also, just because it's considered a sport doesn't mean it shouldn't be done by other people. Like,
that's like saying that like I could never go to the gym and play pickup basketball because I'm not like trying to go to the NBA. I could never play flag football in the backyard with my son because neither one of us are going to the NFL, or at least.
Do you have to disclose that you're a Division I basketball player? Like, if you were to go to a gym to play some pickup ball, like, are you like, all right, guys, I may not look it right now, but just so you know.
I realize that I'm 5'11" and white. However, I'm about to break somebody's ankles.
You're like Woody Harrelson. You just draining threes out there. Like,
you're like, hey, dude,
I
know you don't think to, but you're gonna want to lace those shoes up. Otherwise, you're gonna
pass that ball to me.
Otherwise, I'm gonna tear you out of those shoes.
And I love it. Brandon dropped a great comment. If you want to pull that up, our needs differ by degree, not kind.
Yeah,
that's one of the classic Glassman quotes.
So, and I think this is so. If we go in implementation, CrossFit is quite simply the sport of fitness. We have learned that harnessing the natural camaraderie, competition, and fun of sport or game yields an intensity that cannot be matched by any other means. The late Colonel Jeff Cooper observed that the fear of sporting failure is worse than the fear of death. It is our observation that men will die for points, using the whiteboards as scoreboards, keeping accurate scores and records, running a clock, and precisely defining the rules and standards of performance. We not only motivate unprecedented output, but derive both relative and absolute metrics at every workout. This data has important value well beyond motivation. And I think that's also something that gets overlooked or misinterpreted or just forgotten in the whole thing, which is like the sport nature of it allowed it to drive the singular variable that would get the outcome that people were wanting, right? So when we talk about, hey, what do you want in any training modality? I want a result. How do you get results? Add intensity. How do you ramp up intensity? Line yourself up next to somebody else and do it that way, right? And I think that was the piece that was missing in a lot of scenarios, if in fact people were trying to drive. So like same thing for like Olympic weightlifting. If we didn't measure it and we didn't make it a sport, would anybody give a shit about weightlifting? Probably not. Same thing for powerlifting, right? If there was no sport where you went and did bench, squat, dead, nobody would care about powerlifting. They just wouldn't. And it's okay. I think the what needs to be understood there is that like it allows for that to be introduced, which allows people to move the needle to get the adaptation they're looking for. But like in every sport, it needs to be treated appropriately. There's a time and a place to make something competitive. But just because it is competitive and it can be used as a sport and we can measure it, doesn't mean that we need to bludgeon ourselves or other people with it.
I think also, if you pull that back up, Cody, that sentence or two that you read is the reason most people listening fell in love with CrossFit.
Of course.
Myself included. And I've heard Greg Amundsen say this, who, by the way, if you don't know who Greg Amundsen is, OG, fire breather, like always on the .com back when Fern and I found CrossFit, just crushing workouts. And he said he remembers the time Coach Glassman had someone else show up to class, and he was like, "You're gonna go against him in this workout."
Right.
And he's like, "I never heard that. Like, it was always like you're working out, but like we're actually competing against each other." And I don't care who's in class with you. I tell the story about the time I was dying in a workout and I looked across the room and there was 70-year-old Donna with PVC. And I believe the workout ended with 10 thrusters and I picked up 115. And I was like, I'm going unbroken because I want to beat Donna. And I didn't give a shit how old she was, what her gender was, how much weight she was moving. But it made me pick up a bar and do 10 reps unbroken, which I would not have done by myself.
Human beings are just like mildly better, more intelligent animals. If I put two horses next to each other, they're going to race. Whether they know that they're where they're going or not, they're going to race. Right? Like that's just the way
and
it
yes,
works.
I beat Donna, Cody. I beat her. She broke up that PVC. I went unbroken.
He actually killed Donna.
No, Donna actually just turned 80. She was one of my very first one-on-one clients. She's 80 years old, still doing, just completely showing people like you're so wrong about CrossFit because Donna's 80. She's traveling the world, like living her best life. And I think most of that is because she does CrossFit.
Well, what's interesting about that whole thing about just the introduction of the sport and competing and stuff is like you don't have to do anything else other than put people in a room together. You don't have to put more gasoline on the fire. You don't have to do any of that. You don't even have to talk about it. It simply exists, and it will happen whether you like it or not. It's just the nature of human beings. Right.
Yeah,
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Working out with others helps you work out harder, right? And that's the beauty of it, right? It's just like it's baked into the cake. The safety, it's baked into the cake because they're functional movements. The intensity, it's baked into the cake because I put a series of human beings in the room who are all doing the same thing. It's baked into the cake, which is what makes it so effective. We just need to make sure that we execute it appropriately from a coaching standpoint.
And I can tell you this in real life, it's right now, in between homes, I'm bouncing around, just trying to squeeze workouts in. And then we go to when you were in town a couple weeks ago, we filmed some dropping in episodes, and it's like, oh, this is so much more fun. I naturally just go a little harder than I would by myself. And the endorphins, the dopamine, like, yes, just exercising, going for a walk, you will release some, but I'm positive there's on a scientific level, it's so much different working out with other people, right? The best programming in the world, like we talked about with Ryan Fisher, right? On the podcast, has to have an X factor, and that X factor is you're enjoying it. And the truth is, in CrossFit, the workouts are somewhat insignificant, right? At the end of the day, it's like I'm showing up, there's 7, 12, 15 other people here, and we're going to exercise. And because of that, I'm going to get fitter, and I'm going to have a better day, the best hour of my day. And it's going to lead to a better life. And I think that is what cannot be understated when it comes to CrossFit.
Which kind of goes to this last piece about adaptation, and then we can kind of wrap up the show. But like our commitment to evidence-based fitness, which he's referring to measurable, observable, repeatable, or the quantification of whatever you did that day, time, reps, distance, publicly posting performance data, co-developing our program in collaboration with other coaches, and our open source charter in general have well positioned us to garner important lessons from our program to learn precisely and accurately, that is, about the adaptations elicited by CrossFit programming. That's the beauty of the whole thing, right? It's just like that pair, 2 sentences or whatever that is like the adaptation comes by introducing broad spectrum of movements and modalities, ramping up the intensity by putting human beings in another room, and then by using movements that have high power output, right? And it drives whatever adaptation you would be looking for, quite frankly. It doesn't even matter. Like if you were doing those things, you would largely start to have some degree of improvement in those things. Like if you couldn't throw, you would be stronger and be able to throw. You would fundamentally understand core to extremity movement patterns, and it would just be a little bit different coaching, a little bit different cues. Put your feet here instead of here, and now I want you to rotate at the hips and then throw. Like it would all bleed over. What we have discovered is that CrossFit increases work capacity across broad time and modal domains. This is part of the definition of fitness. This is a discovery of great importance, and I think it's supposed to say importance, and has come to motivate our programming and refocus our efforts. This far-reaching increase in work capacity supports our initially stated aims of building broad, general, and inclusive fitness program. It also explains the wide variety of sport demands met by CrossFit, as evidenced by our deep penetration among diverse sports and endeavors. We've come to see increased work capacity as the holy grail of performance improvement and all our common metrics like VO2 max lactate threshold, body composition, and even strength and flexibility as being correlates, derivatives even. We would not trade improvements in any other fitness metric for a decrease in work capacity. And I think that's important, right? So it's important about like that's also not to state that those other things have no value, right? VO2 max, lactate threshold, flexibility, they do have value. But now we're talking about to what aim do they have value and for who and what are they trying to achieve? Obviously, somebody who needs more flexibility because you're specializing, that's different. The desired outcome is different, right? We're talking about the human being absent of any sort of specialty or sport. How would I create the most well-rounded human being, right? That's what we're talking about.
You talk about how we've ran through multiple lectures here. I mean, this goes to the fitness lecture. And by the way, if you're still here and you have questions for me and Fern before we wrap up, please drop them in the comments. But in the fitness lecture, we're like, well, how much do I need of X or Y, meaning flexibility or strength or speed? And it's, hey, enough to increase work capacity across broad time and modal domains. And this goes to the point of so many people in the CrossFit world immediately default to, well, I need to get stronger. Well, do you? Because you can't touch your toes. And I'm pretty sure if you were able to touch your toes, you'd be able to snatch more or do,
and your back, and your back wouldn't hurt, which would improve your sleep.
Yeah. So like Christian says, we want to know what you can actually do. And really those things are, if it's how much do you need? It's you need enough to improve your fitness. And too many people focus on what they enjoy, myself included. For the record, I love squatting heavy. I do it once a week. I don't need to be squatting heavier. I need to be working on my muscle ups, or I need to be working on running. There's a balance of I enjoy this shit, so I do it, but also what's your end goal? And the end goal of this program, we talk about the dose, constantly very functional movements and high intensity. The response or the adaptation is fitness, work capacity across broad time and middle domains.
And I think you could have a couple things that would be at odds here, right? So just kind of real quick, devil's advocate, because the short and sweet of that is, hey, we don't actually care what kind of training you do, as long as it elicits the response of me getting better at all of these things. So kind of like the black box theory. I'm gonna keep putting things in, and all I really care about is the outcome. To some degree, I don't actually care what happens inside the box. And you have to be able to marry that with like this idea, because we're human beings. We have this need or desire to quantify everything, right? Money, social media likes, the weight on the bar, anything and everything. And going into like these other common metrics, if I get hyper focused on driving a particular metric, in many instances, I would do it at the expense of overall output, whatever the output might be, whether it's business output, a car, human being, whatever. So you have to be able to kind of hold two thoughts at once, which is like, hey, this quantification is important and I need to be able to measure it, right? Because that's actually what will allow me to focus on the right areas. And simultaneously, I don't want to focus too much on the inputs at a micro level. I really just want to see what is the output, right? I know generally speaking what the inputs need to be, but if I focus too much in there, the output will not be what I was shooting for, right? And you see these people with these super elaborate programs, and they're not getting the outcome that they want. They're not getting the outcome they want. It's like, well, you're hyper focused on, you're zoomed too far in, right? You're trying to drive a singular metric instead of just being like, what are you deficient at? Let's start there, right? And let's change that, and then let's reassess, and let's put some other inputs in there and just see what the output was. But our desire to understand what happens inside the box can be blinding sometimes. And that can be, if you're programming for your box, just be wary of that. Like, you're not always going to figure out what happens inside the box, right? And to some degree, it doesn't matter. Just know what are the things that move the needle, and then measure what happens when it comes out the other side.
Yeah, we talk about that. Like, really, we don't care what's happening inside, do we?
No, it doesn't
We
matter.
care about the results. No. So, as Cody just said in the comments there, remember, this is our first show breaking down the level 1 manual.
It's gymnastics. It's all gymnastics, Brandon.
Make sure you're following our Instagram, best hour of their day. Make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel here. And we're going to continue to, we went through 2 pages and it took an hour. So we're going to finish this by 2030.
This is going to take us 14 years, everybody.
Yeah, but you're going to know this inside and out. Anything else we want to touch upon for these first few pages?
No, if you guys have questions, you can send them to us during the show. You can send them to us before the show. Cody can kind of categorize or catalog all of those to make sure we get them addressed. But this is going to be fun. And for everybody that's like, you're like, hey man, I've been needing to deep dive into the manual. You don't need to do that anymore. Just listen to the damn podcast. Subscribe, you turds.
That's it. Subscribe, and you're gonna get learned simply by listening. This real quick question for you, Fern. I don't know that we've talked about this too often. How did you find CrossFit back before you took your level 1?
My wife. She's like, hey, I'm gonna go try this thing out.
That's
and
right.
I was like,
at Sherwood's box, right?
Yep. And we rolled in there, and that was it.
Love it. And by the way, guys, speaking of Sherwood, we are going to have some guests on these live episodes breaking down some of these chapters with us. For example, you mentioned Pat Barber earlier of the warm up and workout. He's going to be helping us break down what is fitness, parts 1 and 2 when we get to it, as well as some of the other OGs and legends of the CrossFit EDU department. And if you have any that you would love to see on the show, please let us know, because Fern's Rolodex, now that he's a flow master, runs deep. It runs, and he actually has a Rolodex, which is.
I was going to say, were you the one that brought me up about that? Be like, hey, what? Like, stop using the term. And I'm like, it's a figure of speech. Nobody actually has a Rolodex, and even when I was young, Rolodexes were not a thing.
I remember my aunt had a Rolodex on her desk. Bring this question up, Cody. What is it? Studying for my L3 is what CrossFit gives us to study enough, or should I also definitely jump in your program? Thank you for all the knowledge. Well, you should definitely learn from. I mean, you studied with us. It's basically cheating. Would you say, Fern? It's cheating. You show up to YouTube on Wednesdays, you're cheating. You're going to get all the information you need right here.
Think of it like steroids. This is performance enhancing drugs for your level 3 prep.
That is right. That is right. No, but you know,
we're gonna call this the PEDs of CrossFit information.
And I want to say this about the level 3 DT said on our show. The people that pass the level 3 do study, but also are the ones that live and breathe CrossFit, right?
Correct.
It's when you start getting distracted by shiny objects and other things, and you start looking at questions like through that lens versus this manual right here. Everything we just broke down. If you look at the questions, if you start to look at things through these lenses of CrossFit, you're going to be just fine when it comes to that test. All right. Fern, I know you got family in town, right?
I do. I got to go see my the people that brought me into this world are at home babysitting my children right now.
I don't know if you're still allowed to quote Bill Cosby, but I will anyway.
At the sake of being canceled. Yeah, at the risk of being canceled.
He said, I brought you into this world, I'll take you out. And that was one of my favorite Cosbyisms. But yeah, your dad's in town.
Definitely told me that.
Yeah, and so go spend some time with your folks. By the way, if anybody was interested, it is Fern's birthday tomorrow.
So technically it's not my birthday. It will be my birthday.
It will be your birthday in about 9 hours from now. So if you want to send Fern some love, head over to his social media at jfern3. Shoot him a birthday message tomorrow. And then the next day, follow up with a happy anniversary because it's his anniversary as well. So Fern, like anything in life, he makes life easier, consolidates, and he just, make sure he doesn't miss things, birthday, anniversary.
Back to back,
right
baby.
On top
back to
of
back.
each other. Oh, we got Teffy's watching, by the way. Look at that. Yeah.
If you want to know how much of an idiot I am, my wife was like, listen, you have to remember one number for our anniversary, and it's just the number 1. Because our anniversary is 11/11/11.
11/11/11. And I'm gonna put a little pressure. Teffy, if you're still listening, we're gonna have you hop on one of these shows and break down the manual with us. And we're gonna do it
in Espanol.
Spanish. Yeah, in Espanol, exactly. So Teffy, you heard it here. She's Teffy, which region? She runs a region, right?
I don't as a regional rep. I don't know, Teffy. Yes, Teffy, you're a regional rep.
She's a badass, longtime member.
It would be Mexico. It would be Mexico if she does, but I don't know.
That's racist, I believe.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're gonna wrap up before Ferg gets too racist on this show. Country
manager
that's
of
what it is.
Mexico.
Yeah.
That's right. Hey, pull her comment over there so people know who we're talking about here, Cody.
Yeah.
Yeah, right here.
Yeah.
Right here.
OG.
She's fit too.
Beast. Yeah, I was gonna say she is fitter than us. So maybe we'll have her talk about one of the movement. We'll break those down. And this is great. I had a great time, Fern. I feel better prepared. I'm actually giving the What is CrossFit lecture this weekend, which, by the way, is my favorite lecture to give.
You know what I'm going to tell you?
Don't fuck it up.
Don't fuck it up.
Don't fuck it up. All right, Cody. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for watching. We appreciate you guys. See you next Wednesday live here. Best hour of their day.